sometimes it's just been so natural to us, we don't realize that we're, maybe a strong way to say it is we're cursing our future. You can curse your future or you can bless your future. So be careful what you say.
I think, I love where you say, we need to send out.
Well, I think in that case, God was saying, I am everything, because I am.
Right.
Now, mine is a different take on it. It is what follows the word I am, I believe you're inviting into your life.
That's part of our message is, you don't know what, God's dream for your life is bigger than your own. And that's what I've seen. I mean, I never dreamed 13 years ago that I'd be sitting here with you, or we'd be in the arena where I used to watch the Rockets play. And so,
for nearly 3 decades, Joel Osteen has stood on the stage of the largest church in America, smiling under the lights of a former basketball arena, telling millions of people that better days are coming. His books have sold in the tens of millions, his sermons have aired in over 100 countries, and his face has become one of the most recognizable in American religious life. But behind the smile, the polish, and the perfectly timed 27-minute sermons, a different story has been building for years, one of financial scrutiny, theological backlash, disaster response controversies, and now, tragedy inside the walls of his own church. This is the story of how Joel Osteen built an empire, and why, more than ever, things aren't looking good for him. To understand why the last several years have hit Osteen's reputation so hard, it helps to understand just how far he traveled from where he started. A quiet, camera-shy kid who never wanted to be famous, building an institution so large that its every misstep now plays out in front of a national audience. Joel Osteen was born on March 5, 1963, in Houston, Texas, one of 6 children in a household built entirely around faith. His father, John Osteen, had broken away from the Southern Baptist tradition years earlier after a life-altering event. Joel's older sister Lisa was born with a severe disability, a moment that pushed John and his wife Dodie toward charismatic Christianity and the belief in divine healing. In 1959, John founded Lakewood Church inside a run-down feed store that seated fewer than 250 people. It was humble, small, and unglamorous, nothing like what it would eventually become. Joel grew up watching his father build that church from nothing, but he never wanted to be the one preaching. While his siblings took on visible roles in the ministry, Joel gravitated toward the technical side, cameras, editing, broadcast timing. After graduating high school in Humble, Texas, he enrolled at Oral Roberts University to study radio and television, but dropped out after less than a year. He didn't want a degree. He wanted to build something alongside his father. So at 19, he returned to Houston and began working behind the scenes at Lakewood, eventually launching the church's television ministry in 1982. By the late 1970s, that same feed store congregation had grown to more than 5,000 people, and Joel grew up watching his father and siblings take turns in front of the growing crowd while he stayed in the background, more comfortable behind a camera than in front of one. He would later describe those years as the period in which he absorbed everything about ministry without ever intending to use it himself, watching, editing, and re-watching his father's sermons so many times that he could likely have recited long stretches of them from memory, all while insisting to anyone who asked that preaching simply wasn't for him. For 17 years, Joel Osteen stayed almost entirely off camera. He produced the broadcasts, directed the shots, and made sure Lakewood's Sunday services looked as polished as anything on network television. When his father asked him to step up and preach, he consistently refused. "You're the preacher," he reportedly told his father. "I'll make you look good on TV." That changed on January 17, 1999, when Joel delivered his first sermon. 6 days later, John Osteen died of a heart attack. The sermon that was supposed to be a one-time favor became the last one his father ever heard, and Joel, with no formal theological training and no preaching experience, was suddenly the leader of a congregation of roughly 6,000 people. What happened next surprised almost everyone, including Osteen himself. Within 5 years, weekly attendance at Lakewood exploded from around 8,000 to somewhere between 25 and 30,000, making it the largest single congregation in the country. Osteen doubled the church's investment in television airtime, bought billboard space along major highways, and delivered sermons that leaned heavily on optimism, self-belief, and encouragement rather than the fire and brimstone style many associated with televangelism. Whatever the reason, people kept tuning in, and the crowds kept growing past the point that Lakewood's original building could hold. That growth led to one of the boldest real estate moves in modern American religious history. In 2003, Lakewood signed a deal with the city of Houston to lease the Compaq Center, the former home of the Houston Rockets, a 16,000-seat arena. The lease alone was reported to cost around $12 million over 30 years, and the church poured roughly $95 million into renovating the space, adding new floors, broadcast studios, and classrooms inside what had once been a professional sports venue. On July 16, 2005, the doors opened to a full house, and within a few years weekly attendance had climbed past 40,000 people, with television broadcasts reportedly reaching an estimated 10 million viewers across more than 100 countries. Lakewood had gone from a feed store congregation to a full-scale media institution. Osteen's rise wasn't just about attendance numbers, it was about publishing. His first book, Your Best Life Now, released in October 2004, sold over 500,000 copies within 3 months and passed 1 million by the following spring. It spent more than 200 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and eventually sold over 4 million copies worldwide, turning a first-time author with no formal writing background into one of the best-selling religious authors of his generation. He went on to write more than a dozen additional books, several of which also became bestsellers, while building out a touring business called A Night of Hope that filled arenas across the country and eventually overseas, including a sold-out event at London's Wembley Arena. Combined with a large social media following and a licensing and merchandise operation tied to the church, the Osteen name became not just a ministry brand but a commercial one. That commercial success also invited its own share of legal friction. In 2011, an electronic music group sued Lakewood and Osteen, alleging the church had continued using one of their songs after a licensing agreement had expired, and sought roughly $3 million in damages. The church argued the situation stemmed from a licensing misunderstanding rather than any deliberate infringement, and in 2012 a judge ultimately sided with Lakewood. The case itself was a minor footnote in the larger story of Osteen's rise, but it illustrated something that would come up again and again in the years that followed. An institution operating at Lakewood scale, with television deals, publishing contracts, licensing agreements, and a nationwide touring business, was bound to generate the kind of disputes that a small neighborhood church simply never would. His personal life has often been presented alongside that success story. Osteen met his wife, Victoria, in 1985 when he walked into a Houston jewelry store to get a watch battery replaced. She was working there while studying psychology at the University of Houston. They married in 1987, long before Joel ever stepped onto a pulpit, and have remained married for nearly 4 decades. Victoria eventually became a co-pastor at Lakewood, launched the church's women's ministry in 2003, and became a best-selling author in her own right. Their 2 children, Jonathan and Alexandra, grew up inside the ministry. Jonathan studying radio, television, and film before eventually preaching his own sermons, and Alexandra becoming a vocalist in the church's worship band. Both children performed in front of enormous crowds well before adulthood, part of a new generation being groomed, whether intentionally or not, to eventually carry the Osteen name forward the same way Joel once carried his own father's ministry into a new era. That kind of family succession has become common among America's megachurches, and it raises its own long-term question for Lakewood. What happens to an institution this large once its founding personality steps aside? Joel Osteen is now in his 60s, and while there is no public indication that he plans to retire soon, the same structural reality that made Lakewood possible, a made-for-television personality whose delivery, timing, and public persona are inseparable from the brand itself, could just as easily make a transition difficult whenever it eventually comes. But the same style that made Osteen famous is also what drew some of the sharpest criticism from within Christianity itself. Osteen has long been associated with prosperity gospel theology, the idea that faith, positive confession, and belief can lead to material blessing, financial success, and physical health. He has been quoted describing God's will for believers as including paid bills and freedom from debt. Supporters point to this as an uplifting, accessible message that has brought people who might never otherwise engage with religion into contact with faith and hope. Critics, including prominent theologians such as Michael Horton and the late J.I. Packer, have argued that this framing sidesteps core Christian concepts like sin, repentance, and grace, reducing the faith to what some have derisively called a feel-good message without real theological substance. Osteen has openly acknowledged that he prefers to focus on encouragement rather than sin and judgment, a stylistic choice that has made him one of the most popular preachers in America and, simultaneously, one of the most theologically controversial. Part of what makes this criticism sting is that Osteen's own father built Lakewood on a very different foundation. John Osteen was known for lengthy, doctrine-heavy sermons steeped in Scripture, and some longtime observers of the church have pointed to the contrast between father and son as evidence of exactly how far Lakewood's message has drifted from its roots. Where John Osteen taught Scripture verse by verse, Joel's sermons are famously light on direct biblical citation, built instead around personal anecdotes, motivational storytelling, and a delivery style that critics have compared more to a keynote speaker than a preacher. Supporters counter that this accessibility is precisely why Osteen has reached audiences that traditional expository preaching never could, people who might never set foot in a church otherwise, but who found something in Osteen's message that felt worth returning to. Questions have also followed Lakewood's handling of core Christian sacraments like baptism and communion, which some observers have said receive less regular emphasis at Lakewood than at more traditional congregations, feeding a perception that Osteen's ministry prioritizes an inspirational, TV-friendly format over long-standing liturgical practice. Lakewood has held large baptism events, including one in 2025 in which hundreds were baptized at once, suggesting the church does still make room for these traditions, even if critics argue they remain secondary to the weekly message of encouragement that defines the Osteen brand. That tension between popularity and scrutiny became financial in 2020, during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Lakewood Church received approximately $4.4 million through the Federal Paycheck Protection Program, a loan program designed to help small businesses and nonprofits keep employees on payroll during shutdowns. According to a church spokesperson, the funds went entirely toward payroll and benefits for the roughly 370 people the church employed, and none of it went to Joel or Victoria Osteen, who have not drawn a salary from Lakewood since 2004. Even so, the loan sparked significant backlash, particularly from church-state separation advocacy groups who argued that a congregation with a reported $90 million annual budget, led by a pastor whose net worth has been estimated at anywhere from $50 to $100 million, didn't need emergency small business relief funds intended for struggling companies. After sustained public criticism, Lakewood repaid the loan in full in October 2021. The church framed the loan as a responsible decision made during genuine uncertainty about how long the shutdown would last. Critics framed it as an example of a wealthy institution crowding out resources meant for businesses that were actually at risk of collapse. Money has followed Osteen into other controversies as well, particularly around how the church allocates its budget. Public reporting on Lakewood's finances has shown that only a small percentage of its annual spending, commonly cited around 1 to 1.5%, goes toward missions and outreach programs, with a much larger share of the budget going toward television production, weekly services, events, and administrative costs. Because churches in the United States are not required to file the same financial disclosures with the IRS that other nonprofits must file, the public rarely gets a complete picture of megachurch finances, and Lakewood is no exception. That lack of transparency has fueled ongoing public suspicion, even though it isn't unique to Osteen. It's a structural feature of how religious organizations are regulated in America. That regulatory gap is part of why so much of the public conversation about Osteen's wealth is built on estimates rather than confirmed figures. Reported figures for his personal net worth have ranged anywhere from roughly $50 million to as much as $100 million, drawn largely from his book royalties, speaking fees, and licensing income rather than any church salary. He is reported to live in a mansion valued at more than $10 million, along with an additional property valued around $3 million. None of that is inherently improper. Authors and public speakers are generally free to profit from their own work, but the optics of that kind of personal wealth, sitting alongside a congregation whose media member is far from wealthy, and a charitable giving line item in the low single digits, have made Osteen an easy target for critics who argue his version of the prosperity gospel seems to work out best for the man preaching it. If the PPP loan controversy tested Osteen's financial reputation, Hurricane Harvey in August 2017 tested something else entirely: his church's willingness to act as a physical refuge in a moment of civic crisis. As floodwaters overwhelmed Houston, Lakewood posted on Facebook that the building was inaccessible due to severe flooding and directed people to other shelters instead. Almost immediately, social media users posted photos and videos appearing to show dry streets and an undamaged building nearby, and the backlash was swift and intense, with the hashtag #OpenLakewoodChurch spreading widely online. Osteen and church leadership pushed back, saying the arena's lower levels, including the garage and basement, genuinely had taken on water, and that floodgates around the building had been holding back rising water until conditions eased. 2 days after the initial post, the church opened its doors, ultimately serving as a distribution and donation center for the community rather than a shelter of first resort. In later interviews, Osteen said publicly that reporting had been driven by a false narrative, while church leadership later admitted the criticism had at least pushed them to respond faster in future disasters. The truth of what actually happened inside the building during those first days remains genuinely disputed even now, but the reputational damage from Harvey has followed Osteen for years, resurfacing as a reference point whenever another storm hits Texas. That resurfacing happened again in 2025, when another major storm struck the region. This time, Lakewood distributed roughly 40,000 bottles of water and food to those affected, and Osteen posted on social media asking his followers to join him in prayer for fellow Texans. For some, it was proof the church had learned from Harvey. For others, particularly on social media, the response still felt inadequate for an institution of Lakewood's size and wealth, and the old jokes about the church locking its doors returned almost instantly. Then, in February 2024, tragedy struck Lakewood in a way no public relations strategy could manage. On February 11th, a 36-year-old woman named Janesse Yvonne Moreno entered the church carrying an AR-15 style rifle and a backpack, accompanied by her 7-year-old son. She claimed to be carrying a bomb, though none was ever found, and opened fire in a hallway of the church during the start of a Spanish-language service. She wounded a man in his late 40s before 2 off-duty officers serving as church security shot and killed her. In the exchange of gunfire, her young son was also shot and critically injured. Investigators later reported that Moreno had a documented history of mental illness, including schizophrenia, along with a criminal record, and that her rifle had been purchased legally just months before the shooting despite Texas having no red flag law that might have flagged her as a risk. Police also found writings connected to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories on her devices, along with a sticker referencing Palestine on her weapon, though authorities have said the full motive behind the shooting remains unclear even after a lengthy investigation, with the case eventually moving toward a grand jury review. The child's recovery, by all public accounts, was long and difficult, and the family continued to face hardship in the months that followed as they tried to rebuild some version of normal life after the shooting. It was the kind of aftermath that no sermon, however well delivered, could really resolve, and it left the surrounding community grappling with loss well after the initial news cycle moved on. In the aftermath, Osteen addressed his congregation with the same message that has defined his ministry for 25 years. Have faith, don't shrink back, keep moving forward. For many in his congregation, that message offered real comfort during a horrifying moment. For others, including families of victims and outside faith leaders, the response felt inadequate to the scale of what had happened, sidestepping harder conversations about gun access, the state of the country's mental health infrastructure, and the specific security failures that allowed an armed woman to walk into one of the most visible religious buildings in America. The shooting reopened questions that had followed Lakewood for years about how a church of its size, wealth, and public profile handles safety, transparency, and institutional accountability when something goes wrong. All of this is unfolding at a moment when the ground underneath megachurches like Lakewood is shifting in a way no PR strategy can fully counter. Surveys have repeatedly shown that religious attendance among younger Americans has fallen to historic lows, with only a small percentage of both millennials and Gen Z reporting they attend church regularly.